we will be kicking off. So thanks very much for joining us, and we'll be kicking off in a couple of minutes. Okay, I think we have a decent amount of people in now. So Joanne, if you're ready, we might kick off.
That's great. Thanks very much, Coach.
Okay, so look, just to start off this session by saying welcome to the HR Q&A. Obviously today we are focusing on workplace health and safety. And we are joined today, we're delighted to be joined today by Joanne Harmon. Joanne is Head of Business and Education Supports with the Health and Safety Authority. She is responsible for development of resources and supports for business to help them comply with safety, health and welfare work legislation. And she's also responsible for the education strategy of the HSA from primary through tertiary education and work-based learning. And she is chairperson of QQI. So we're absolutely delighted to have her and her expertise here today. So how we're going to structure this, just so that you know, is Joanne is going to do a short PowerPoint presentation where she's going to cover off the general area and a lot of general information. And then we're going to kick into the specific questions that have been sent through in advance of this. Now, if you have questions as we're going through, you can absolutely pop them into the chat, and time allowing, we'll deal with as many of those as we can as well. Now, if you do pop in a question and we don't get to it, we will follow up with you afterwards. And then I suppose just to reference that, a recording of this will be circulated to everyone who has joined us. So you will have this afterwards to refer to as well. And then I suppose the other thing I do just want to mention is that in relation to this, ISME SkillNet are running a HR Essentials course. It's kind of being done in bite-sized sessions over a couple of lunchtimes in May, and it is linking in very nicely with this because there is a lot of reference to managing people remotely and managing remote and blended workforces. So it might be worth having a look at on our ISME SkillNet section of the website. So without further ado, Joanne, I think, do you want to kick off with your presentation?
I will indeed, Coach. Thanks very much. And just to say good morning to everybody, and good morning to yourself, Coach. We're delighted to be partnering with ISME, in fact, in this event and in other events that we will be organising. And I suppose it's timely that we're looking at health and safety today, because as we know, one of the big focuses at the moment is I suppose looking to the future around remote working. We have a lot of people home working at the moment, and that's one of the main focuses that we're going to have a look today. So I might ask you, Ciara, to jump down there. That's great, onto our first slide. I suppose just to put a bit of context on this, what I'd like to do really is to flag some of the main resources that you're going to find useful, I think, today, and to really to give you those signposts to where you can go for the more detailed information. And just in relation to homeworking in particular, I suppose one of the things you've probably noticed the other day was the launch of the strategy around rural development, and the government just a couple of months ago launched the a national remote working strategy. And I suppose it's important because it's quite an ambitious strategy, and it is, I suppose, really looking to make remote and home working a permanent feature of the Irish workplace. And the government are looking at things like the right to disconnect through a code of practice, the right to request home working, and it has the intention of having 20% of the public service working remotely. So I think that's an important background to kind of and a context to take into account. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is a new section of the HSA website, which holds all of our remote working resources. So the link is up there, and it'll also be obviously circulated to you afterwards. It's in the presentation. There are kind of four key. One is new guidance we have on working from home for employers and employees. Then we have some FAQs for employers and employees on working from home, particularly on a temporary basis. And really what we're talking about there is during COVID. Then we have some good resources and advice around ergonomics, setting your workstation up properly when you're working remotely, and remote working stress. So Ciara, I might get you to move on there again. That's great. So I suppose it's just an important distinction to bear in mind there. And when we look at this section on remote working in our web, we can see we have some good FAQs there for employers and employees, very much aimed at all of us who found ourselves working from home on a temporary basis, overnight due to COVID. So the kitchen tables, the desks, the island units where people have found themselves really longer than many of us thought. But there's some good practical advice there for you around that kind of temporary arrangement. But then I suppose where we're looking to develop and to provide more detailed advice for you is around planning for future remote working arrangements. And that's where we have guidance on working from home for employers and employees. And we have a very nice handy risk assessment template and checklist which goes with that. And that's really around, we know the conversations people are having now with their employees, looking at their own businesses and maybe planning for the future. How would I go about putting this in place? How do I plan for the future? And as I said, there's a very handy little risk assessment template there. And really what we're talking about there when we talk about risk assessment is really looking at the things that might cause harm and talking about and documenting what we're going to do about them. So it's a very straightforward process. Ciara, I might get you to take it down there again. And just very briefly, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think it's important to make clear, sometimes I think people get a bit nervous when they think about remote working or what it might mean for employers. Under health and safety legislation, the same duties apply. Employers have the same duties towards employees who are working from home or working remotely as they have towards employees located in the workplace. So that's just an important one. There's nothing new there, but it's the same, if you like. It's the same kind of duty. So what does that look like in a remote working context? Well, it's making employees aware of any specific risks regarding working from home, if that's what they're going to do, and that's what they want to do, and that's what's agreed. And it's ensuring that the work and the workspace are suitable for the work to be done. And that's a key consideration. Is this work suitable for being done at home? Are the tasks suitable? Is the work suitable? And is the workspace suitable? And they're important questions to be answered. The employer must provide suitable and safe equipment to enable the work to be done that the employer wants done in the home. You must have pre-arranged means of contact with the employee, and you must carry out a risk assessment of the employee's workstation. Again, this is something very straightforward. It's nothing new, and there are very straightforward tools and supports to show employers how this is done. And then to provide any necessary training that might be required around working from home. So on to our employee duties. Again, important just to recognise that employees have duty also. And when they're looking, for example, for a suitable space for home working, it's the employee that must ensure that they have suitable light, for example, heat, ventilation, and to be able to work comfortably. That's not the employer's responsibility. They must keep the workspace tidy, keep the work area free from interruptions and distractions, make sure the floor is clean, dry, and free from, for example, slip, trip and falls hazards, which is one of the main workplace accidents that we would see in the authority. They need to provide suitable power sockets, for example, and avoid trailing cables, overloading of sockets, that sort of thing. And obviously ensure that they have adequate broadband and phone capability to be able to do the work from home. So I might get you, Ciara, to click on there. That's great. So I suppose there's kind of 5 steps we would say to putting in place and managing a good home working relationship. And these are all contained in the guidance on working from home for employers and employees. Very straightforward. And I would say the most important aspect of this would be to develop your home working policy. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Step 2, obviously you're consulting with employees and you're identifying and you've a process in place around, who wants to work from home, who will work from home, and how those decisions are made. You'll be identifying in step 3 what equipment and resources are required for that work to be done from home. Step 4 is around the risk assessment and checklist, which is in the guidance. There's a really good template there to help employers to assess that risk, because it is your duty as an employer to make sure that you're providing safe systems of work and safe work activities for your employee. And again, step 5 there, it's about monitoring the arrangement once it's in place, reviewing the arrangement, keeping an open mind, and making sure you have good communication with your employees in that whole process and on an ongoing basis. Okay, I might get you to move that down. Great. So developing a home working policy, we get a lot of queries around this in the authority, so I thought it'd be worthwhile just popping up something in the slides, and it is also contained in the guidance. It's really important that you set out the employer obligations and the employee obligations, because there are 2 sets of responsibilities here. Secondly, the criteria for when employees work from home and the requirements. Again, that's really, really important that it's clear, when is this going to be permitted, how often, and what the requirements are. You'll provide information on the arrangements for risk assessment of the home working space. And again, when we say risk assessment of the home working space, we're talking about that workstation. That's something that happens already in the workplace, and largely it's done remotely now, in fact, and it's usually done online using smartphones, other kind of technology that's out there, but it is done remotely, because what you're not doing is having somebody, certainly during COVID, walking into your home and assessing a workstation. But it is important that if the employer envisages that they would like to have a face-to-face arrangement for that risk assessment, that would be outlined in the home working policy, so it's clear for all to see in advance. Responsibilities of employees to report any risks or work-related accidents or injury that might happen to them when they're at work. They need to make sure that information is coming back to the employer. And it should provide information on the suitability of the workspace for the work to be carried out. That's really, really important, because there's no point in somebody signing up and then being permitted to work from home, in fact, for work that is not capable of being done at home. What is the type of work to be undertaken, and on what basis? Are we looking full-time, part-time, on an ad hoc basis? I think a lot of the surveys we've seen that have been done at the moment, a lot of people are saying they would like some kind of hybrid arrangement, so not a full-time arrangement, and that's something that needs to be included in the policy. What is the equipment that will be required or provided? Again, what are the things we're talking about there? It's usually and the employee themselves might have this already. This is the, what do they need to do the job that they don't have? I guess the desk, the chair, is it the monitor, is it the keyboard? Are they bringing their laptop, using it at work and they're bringing it home? So all of that is part of the discussion, but should be included in the policy. And then the means of communication and training is also critical if it's required as part of home working. Thank you, Ciara. And then just lastly around that, I just have a series of links to further resources, and they're important. The government's remote strategy is up there. Our guidance on working from home for employers and employees is there with that template risk assessment. That's really important to say. There's a really nice visual template, very, very simple and straightforward. It's important to say the risk assessment does have to be carried out by what we call a competent person. So somebody with enough training experience and knowledge to do that. And again, a lot of employers either train up somebody to do that work, or else they use the services of an external person to do that. There's also a range of other guidance and tools there, which I think would be important to check out. And just the last two that you'll see at the bottom of the page, I think it's important to mention the Health and Safety Authority has a free risk assessment tool and safety statement tool for your business, which you can, as an employer, use to conduct risk assessments and safety statements in general in your business. The Workstation risk assessment is a little bit different. That's more specific. And hsalearning.ie, that's the authority's free e-learning portal, which has a large number of courses there that you can take free of charge and get records of completion and certification from. So, Coach, I might leave it there just by way of intro and hope that there's some good information there that people can take away. And as I said, they'll have the slides afterwards.
Perfect. Apologies, technical difficulties there. That's brilliant, Joanne. Thanks very much. That was really informative. I suppose there was a lot in there, but a lot of it is common sense, and it's really just an extension of what employees are doing in the workplace anyway, just kind of extending it to home. Would it be?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's very much that. As I said, the duties are the same, and it's just a matter of, I suppose, getting your head around the fact that you have to do it in a different way. But it can be done. It can be straightforward. It is straightforward, I think. But I think that, as I said, the important thing will be that upfront policy, so that everybody's clear how the rules work and what are the rules. Because it might be that the work, for example, is not suitable to be done at home, and there's a call to be made.
Absolutely. Okay, well, look, we'll launch into the questions that were sent in before this straight away. So the first one I have on my list here is, if we implement an amendment to staff contracts with regards to remote working, can we allow it on a temporary basis? And if it does not suit the business, can we change it back to full-time in the office? So I might start with this one, Joanne. In terms of the HR side of it, absolutely. What I would say is that if you build it into your contract, if you're making an amendment to a contract and you want it on a trial basis, build that into the contract. Have a clause there that states that this will be reviewed on an ongoing basis, and that the company reserves the right to revert back to original terms and conditions with X amount of notice or however. So absolutely, once you have it built into your contract that you can do it, then you can do it. Second question we have is, should we do a risk assessment where, this is a very hot topic now, where employees refuse to take the vaccine when it is offered? Joanne, I might kick that one over to you to start with. Risk assessments on employees refusing to take the vaccine.
Yeah, well, I suppose the most important thing to say up front is that vaccines are not compulsory under health and safety regulations. We have biological agents regulations that say where a risk assessment shows that there's a risk to the health and safety of an employee due to working with a biological agent, for example, COVID-19, where there's a vaccine available, the employer must offer that vaccine. So that's what the regulations would say. And the answer is no, people, I suppose, do not have to take up the offer of a vaccine, and where they do, that's fine. But if they don't accept the offer of the vaccine, the employer does have to review their risk assessment and make a decision appropriately, whether the employee is considered to be at risk then without the vaccine, depending on the work that's being done. The employer might, in reviewing that risk assessment, might decide that the employee can continue if they can put other control measures in place. But if those additional measures are deemed not to be suitable and the employee would still be at risk, then it is within the employer's rights to redeploy that staff member to other tasks and other work to be done. So that's it in a nutshell. They do have to review their risk assessment and take appropriate action.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think you've covered it off very well there. It is a difficult area for employers to manage, but their risk assessment is absolutely going to be key. The next one I have is can the employer inspect employees working from home workspace?
Okay, well, I suppose that's an interesting one. I suppose when you use the word inspect, what the employer has to do is make sure there's that risk assessment of the employee's workstation, you know, and that VDU assessment, if whether they, you know, if they use display screen equipment, that would be happening in the workplace normally. They still have to do the same thing if the person is working remotely. But when you say inspect, I suppose what I would say there is the employer has to satisfy themselves that the employee is working safely and is set up appropriately to work safely. So that's what that workstation risk assessment will cover off. Now, again, I would go back to the home working policy. You know, if the employer feels that as part of that assessment, again, not during COVID, because obviously everything has to be done remotely, but they want to have some element of face-to-face assessment, that should be stated upfront in the home working policy. So there's no surprises for anybody, I guess, as part of the process and down the line. I mean, primarily the home, you know, we have to remember people's homes are private dwellings. They're not workplaces generally, and it is a special arrangement. So I would say address it up front in the home working policy. But, you know, when we use the word inspect, that's not really something in our parlance in terms of the employer. The employer can certainly, as part of the risk assessment, we get a very good sense of that person's workstation and whether it's safe or not.
Brilliant. Okay, and I suppose this leads into the next question, which is what should be included in a home working from home policy. So we've addressed that fairly thoroughly within your presentation at the start, and I know those slides will be sent around. So we might move on from that one to the next one, which I suppose is another bit of a grey area in this whole thing. Is what are the insurance implications of remote working?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one, and I suppose it's one that is strictly outside the remit of the authority, but the advice we would give certainly is to check with your insurer as an employer and find out what you're covered for when staff are working remotely. Generally, there will be some kind of arrangement, but you need to be very clear about what that arrangement is. And then I would say when you've got that, you know, clear position from your insurer, then make that known to your employees so that they can also check what arrangements they have in place, whether it's around contents, insurance, etc. And again, it's an important one because obviously if you're renting, you might have a different avenue to go to, whether it's landlords or other, than if you're a homeowner. And you can quite quickly and maybe straightforwardly check up, you know, what's covered in your policy. So I would say check with your insurer.
Absolutely. And I think that is the most important thing, is that, you know, really and truly you have to go to the experts on these things. And in this case, the expert is your own insurer. They will know what you need to do and what you need to have to cover yourself. The next question we got in is what professionals are giving advice on health and safety while working remotely at the moment?
Okay, well, I suppose first of all to say that health and safety professionals are, and there are plenty of them out there who offer services. There are chartered health and safety professionals. There are ergonomists out there if people are looking for specific advice around that. There are people who are trained up in display screen equipment assessment, which is what you'll be doing when you're doing your remote working risk assessment. So it's you know, I suppose you're thinking about it in terms of the workstation, you know, is probably largely the same you'll have in your workplace, but there are just different twists to it, I suppose, and that may be, you know, worthwhile getting a little bit of advice around it. But I think your risk assessment of your workstation will cover off an awful lot of that, because it's really a kind of a process involving the employee and the person doing the assessment, looking at the setup, you know, tweaking things here or there, giving a bit of advice. I mean, the reality is people are set up in offices already, and hopefully they're set up safely and their employer will already have done that. So you're hoping that they're pretty much doing something similar at home, and they're set up well. And as I said, that process, through whoever you engage to do it, some employers train up their people to be DSE assessors. There's plenty of training courses out there. And again, you have to be competent. That's the word, the legislation. You have to be competent to do it. So enough training experience and knowledge. And there are courses out there that people can train up and do it, and maybe have somebody internal in the organisation, or else, as I said, use the services of a health and safety professional or consultant.
Okay. And then somebody here is looking for practical advice for home working safety audits. So have you any practical tips for people?
Okay, well, I suppose when we say safety audit, what we have in our guidance for home working is a very handy template for, it's a checklist and template really around risk assessment. So, and it's very visual, it's very short, it's very simple. What the employee would be doing is the employer can send that checklist out to the employee as part of the kind of planning for what you need, if you like. So what do you need working from home? There's the boxes you can tick. When that equipment is then in place, all of the questions and the prompts are in that checklist. So you don't need to be, you know, an expert. There needs to be a competent person assessing it as part of that. But in terms of setting it up, that's fairly straightforward, because the questions are prompted. You know, do you have X? Do you have Y? You know, are you looking out for that? Very, very straightforward, that the employee as well can look at. I think that's really important. It's a partnership thing. I mean, let's face it, the employer is not in the employee's home. This is a collaboration. And I think if people want home working to work, which I think they do, and I think if employees are interested in it, they will want it to work as well. So it's a collaborative process. So I think I wouldn't fear it on the home working basis. In general, when you're talking about the general workplace, again, I would point people to our besmart.ie tool, which is a free risk assessment and safety statement tool. And again, all of the hazards and controls are prompted for you, because in your business, you know, you don't need to, you know, it's common sense. An awful lot of this stuff is common sense, but I think it's really useful when you have those kind of prompts there for you to go, God, I didn't think of that actually. And actually, there's the controls suggested to me that I put in place, and I can put my document nicely together and then take any actions out of that I think necessary.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on a key point there, I suppose, from the HR side of this as well, is the collaboration piece. It's so important to while this was absolutely forced on everyone initially, it's so important to be working with your employees and, you know, including them in processes in as much as you can in order to make this all work. So the next one that I have here, Joanne, is one that it's a very frequently asked question to ourselves in ISME. What is an employer required to provide in terms of equipment for home working?
Okay, well, I suppose what the employer is required to provide, and again, we're thinking of this now, particularly looking forward around planned remote working arrangements, you know, not the fact that we all ended up at the kitchen table overnight during a pandemic, but looking forward in a kind of a planned agreement, you're providing the equipment that the employee needs to do the work you want them to carry out. That's the way I would say it in a nutshell. So for most people, if you're thinking of a workstation, you're looking at a suitable chair. It may be the laptop that they already have, but they're now bringing it home when they're home working. do they need a monitor if they're going to be in front of the VDU all day? Is a monitor going to be provided for them? Do they need a headset for their work? Maybe they don't. A mobile phone, maybe they didn't have one before, but now that there's that arrangement, maybe they need one. And then you could have other, there might be smaller things like obviously a keyboard and a mouse, but again, a lot of people will have those maybe at home already. So again, it's about kind of having the conversation and seeing, well, what are the things you need that are new? But certainly the crux of it really is around what do you want the employee to do? And the onus is on you to provide that equipment.
Okay, and then I suppose that there's a follow-on one here to that question, which is looking at the cost of home working equipment for shared offices and home working into the future. So I suppose, look, obviously there is going to be an element of cost if you're moving from an office to a remote working environment with all of this equipment provided, but it's kind of a how long is a piece of string question, because everything, as you touched on, everything is going to be different. It's going to depend on what the employee requires. It's going to depend on what they already have. It's going to depend on what you've managed to get to them through COVID, and then what you need to update if you're looking at making it more permanent. So I think, Joanne, you might agree with me on that one. It's a difficult question to answer in that it's very specific to each workplace and employee.
Yeah, it is. And I think what a lot of people will do is be practical about it as well and go, well, actually, I already have a desk here that I already use, that I've had for years. And we have to remember, a lot of people are already working the odd day here or there from home and are fairly well set up. So it is about kind of bridging that gap. But, I suppose there's no getting away from the fact that it's up to the employer to bridge the gap and not the employee in that sense. A lot of people don't want, another desk, brought into their house when they have one that is perfectly safe, has the space on it, allows them to have their equipment. So again, I think the conversation is important to have there. But it's a collaboration, but certainly I think in a lot of cases it will be about bridging the gap rather than here's a whole new home office transported into this workspace, because the reality is people may not have the same space available either, and due to even things like data protection or cyber risks or whatever, the equipment may be different that you have at home. It's not a like for like, it's not about going, I need everything around me that I also have in the office, because there are other business risks that have to be taken into account as well. And, it's about setting you up safely, but the employee also has to make sure they have the appropriate workspace. And as I said earlier, the lighting, the ventilation, the heating, the electricity, that's all the employees' responsibility to make sure that they have that, so that they can, I don't like to use the word qualify for home working, but if they want to home work and the employer is considering that, that has to be part of the conversation and possibly the application process, if you like, that you can satisfy that and make sure that you're set up well as an employee to work from home.
Absolutely, and I think this throws back to your slide on the home working policy. The more of this kind of agreement between yourself and the employee that you have in that policy, the more that you can go back to the employee and say, well, look, this is our policy. We need you to have X, Y, and Z. I suppose the stronger position an employer is in through all of this. So that policy is going to be their key document, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one, and I think you've touched on it slightly, but we'll go through it anyway. Do I have to inspect an employee's home to ensure it is safe to work in? And can this be done remotely?
So I suppose, again, the word inspect doesn't quite fit there. What you do have to do is a risk assessment of their workstation. Has to be done by a competent person. And yes, it can be done remotely. And in fact, anyone that's doing them is doing them remotely. And I would say the people who probably used to do them face to face, that may become a thing of the past, because as we all know, technology very straightforwardly through smartphones and other visual aids can very easily help you to do that risk assessment. And again, when I say risk assessment, I'm saying, are you set up correctly? A lot of this is very straightforward, simple advice. And again, we have loads of information on our web around how to set yourself up properly. So again, you'd be giving the information to the employee saying, set yourself up there, there's the information, and then somebody is checking that really and giving you advice on making sure that you do continue to be set up properly. And I suppose just to say to employers as well, we do see a lot of musculoskeletal injuries and upper limb injuries that, you don't want your people to be injured and out sick and, taking time from your business. So if they can be set up properly from the outset, and again, if they're having a difficulty, be able to come back to you and talk about it and see if there's anything else that can be tweaked, whatever, that's a good thing. It's a good thing for employers, and obviously it's a good thing for employees. It'll keep them active and working and productive.
Okay. The next one I have here is, if I have multiple employees working from home, do I have to have a risk assessment for each individual employee?
Well, I suppose the answer is yes, because their workstation has to be risk assessed. But I mean, the template is the same for all. So and the checklist is the same, obviously depending on the kind of work they're doing. But if, again, it's that kind of typical workstation computer type work, you have a very nice template there that an assessor or anybody else can use and the employee can use to set themselves up correctly, because a lot of it is very standardized and very common sense. So I would say the answer to that is yes, but it's not it's not maybe the onerous task that people might think of, lots of different variety and very complicated solutions. This is fairly streamlined information, readily available, and suggests solutions and setups that are very straightforward, that most people are already doing, let's face it, in the workplace.
Okay. So is it enough for me to supply my employee with the information regarding ergonomic setup of their home workstation, or am I required to do more?
Yeah, and I suppose that it's related to the previous questions. It's not enough for the employee for you or the employer just to supply that information. Yes, you're supplying it to them. They're getting well set up, and then you have your assessment, your risk assessment, which is basically the competent person then doing the remote checks to make sure that they're set up properly.
Okay. Now, this next one is, I think there's a health and safety aspect and a HR aspect to this next one, but it's definitely one that I'm seeing a lot of calls on. And there is a huge health and safety aspect to this one. An employee has reported feeling stressed due to a combination of home working and homeschooling. What are my responsibilities here as an employer?
Well, I suppose from a health and safety perspective, stress is a known hazard, and it is included in the normal risk assessment you would have in the workplace. With remote working and home working, I mean, we know, and it is known that working from home or working remotely can cause isolation. People can end up doing much longer hours than they would have done before, and they can end up blurring the lines between home and personal life. Now, if you combine that with a pandemic and people having homeschooling, maybe multiple members of the family at home, children, etc. on top, I think a lot of this is about employers recognizing that they do have a responsibility. And then, it's a very practical kind of response, I would suggest. It's having conversations with people. It's recognizing that this is a difficulty and an issue. Can we demand the same standards of people? And when I say that, I mean at the moment during the pandemic. Again, into the future, it's a slightly different arrangement where somebody wants to put in place an ongoing agreement. I think you have to have understanding, empathy. Can you build in flexibility into the work? Can the work be divided up differently, perhaps amongst the team, just to give that person a little bit of leeway? Because what you don't want is the person to get sick and be out sick on you. And that's what we're trying to avoid. You want to keep people engaged, as productive as they can be, particularly at the moment. And I would say building in the extra informal communication is really important too. The virtual cup of tea, having the chat before the meeting and after, checking in with people, because when you're working remotely, and we all know it, you miss the visual cues, these kind of interactions. You really don't get what's happening for people behind the scenes. So I think you do have to sit up and listen and be a little bit proactive about it. Again, we have lots of really good information on our web, in the remote working section on, again, for employees, how to manage your own stress, how to manage your own behavior. What are good practices to do, when we're in lockdown? Make sure people are taking their breaks, I suppose, as an employer is an important thing you can do, and connect them in with any other supports and information that you have available within the organisation, or that whether you can refer them if there's an OH, facility occupational health, or an employee assistance program, or just any other kind of supports that you have in your organisation. So it is very real. Work-related stress is, stress caused or made worse by work. And a lot of that, can be around the perception that people have around the pressures that the work environment has on them. So I would say the employer does have to respond, but in those kind of very practical and real ways.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important as well. A huge part of dealing with these is it is risk management. Essentially, it is ensuring that you're not allowing something to fester and work its way through to you ending up in worst case scenario, the WRC or something like that. So I think it's very important for employers to remember that even though your employee isn't sitting in front of you every day, that you still have that responsibility to ensure that if they raise any issues like that, that they're dealt with. Even when you're working remotely, you still have to follow through with your procedures. You still have to follow through with your conversations and ensure that if it does get to a case where it turns into an absence, that your absence management procedures are followed, even if they're working remote. And I think one of the big issues definitely that our members are facing is people are definitely not as quick to take a day when they're remote working. So I think there's a little extra responsibility on managers to ensure that somebody isn't ploughing on through stress because they're remote working, because they're afraid to take a sick day and nothing is being done about it. So definitely I'd agree with you on that one. It's a big piece at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I can just say, Coach, actually, one of the things, and we're encouraged to do it, is take your annual leave. Annual leave is there for that purpose. And, if you take it at the appropriate, junctures, it's going to serve you as an employee. And I think employers should be giving that message to employees. Use your annual leave, and then, you don't end up having the sick days, hopefully, because you're getting that break from work and break from the homework environment.
Definitely, and so important from an employment legislation point of view as well, that employers are encouraging people to take their annual leave, because I don't think anyone at the moment is particularly pushed to use it up, and they're hoping that they might have a more exciting way to use it. But absolutely, the leave is there for a reason, and people need their breaks. The next question I have here is actually, it's quite tied into that, and I suppose again, there's two aspects to this one. An employee is regularly emailing late at night. I've discussed their expected working hours, however, they continue to do so. Am I in danger of breaching legislation if I cannot prove that they have received their rest breaks? So there again, Joanne, there's two aspects to this. So I might let you answer, and then I might jump in afterwards, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, I suppose maybe it's more HR than health and safety, but certainly, on the health and safety side, you do need to make sure that you're managing, I suppose, that work activity safely and the systems of work. You're responsible for the systems of work. So if you are noticing that, and I think we've all probably noticed it sometimes when we get emails from colleagues or, people we're dealing with on the outside, late at night, you do wonder, well, gosh, is that just the flexibility I built in for them to have and it suits them? Or has this person been working all day and all night? And is this happening very regularly? So I would say, again, for employers and for supervisors and managers who are maybe closer to those people, keep an eye out for it and encourage people, I suppose, to take their breaks, to plan a proper kind of working day, and then to be able to close the door on it and walk away. And I suppose as employers and managers, like, we need to set a good example around that too, so that we're not, contributing maybe to that person's sense that they have to do these very long hours because we're actually sending the emails late at night. And, while we might be saying one thing about switching off, are we really giving out the right message by kind of contributing maybe to that in another way, by modeling the wrong behavior, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
And I think it's super important to stress as well that even in the midst of COVID, even in the midst of panic remote working, in the midst of all of that, the Organisation of Working Time Act still stands. Employees must get their rest breaks, they must get their time off, they must get all of that, and the onus is absolutely on the employer to ensure that is. However, I suppose it does bring to light that possibly with remote working and with homeschooling and everything going on, some employees may have maybe working on a more flexible work schedule. And I think if that is the case, what an employer needs to do is ensure that they have that documented and that they can still demonstrate that even with this flexible work schedule, even if somebody is working until 9 at night to allow them to deal with their children in the morning, that they have that documented so that they can demonstrate that they're still in line with employment legislation. Now, the next one is a very interesting one, and I think it is one that has affected a number of employers with the sudden move to work from home last March. I'm aware that my employee is living in shared accommodation and is working from a less than ideal workspace. This has occurred as a result of COVID-19, but they've expressed an interest in continuing to work remotely after it. Can I decline a request on this basis, and what are the health and safety concerns here?
But again, I would say go back to your home working policy. It's the most important thing you can do in relation to this, is to have that set up and covering off the criteria and the requirements for working from home. And again, as an employer, the most important question you're asking yourself really is, does this person have a suitable workspace that is, suitable for the work that I'm asking them to carry out? It's the number one thing really. And after that, then you're looking at all of the questions around that. Now, I think you probably have to be careful in this situation, because if an employee is in shared accommodation where there might be 3 or 4 other people, in a house or whatever, that may change in a few months' time when everybody else might go back to work, and this is the only person who's maybe looking to work from home 2 days a week, and they do have an appropriate workspace. So I think you have to be a little bit careful that you're not maybe jumping to conclusions. The other thing is, I suppose, as part of that application process, let's call it, the employee has to make clear that they have this workspace. It is suitable, it can fit the workstation. They know upfront they will be facing this assessment, if you like. So there's no surprises for them. So it's in their interest to really ask themselves the question, is this something I can do safely? And is it free from noise and distractions? Will I be able to get on with the job? And then I think it's important for employers, when they do grant this kind of permission, that it's reviewed, that we're looking at trials, that we're looking at review periods, that we're monitoring it. And then, people can be quite honest with each other and say, well, actually, it has worked, actually, or actually it's not working so well. So I think building in the review periods gives the employer that I suppose the space to be, generous, if you like, but also the opportunity, again, with both sides realizing and understanding that a review and monitoring is part of it, so that there are no surprises down the line when somebody actually is told, actually, this hasn't worked out. Or by the time the risk assessment was done, let's say that actually the feedback from the employer was, this space is totally unsuitable. So I think the policy is the critical piece there, and building in the review and monitoring. The other thing, Coach, I would say is, again, look at, how often is this person looking to work from home? How often are they seeking it? Because obviously, again, what we're hearing is that there's a lot of interest in hybrid arrangements, where people maybe mostly want to be in the office, maybe 2 days a week at home, or maybe 3 days at home and 2 in the office. So you're taking all of that into account. But again, as part of that, let's call it application process, that's going to be very clear to you, as well as the information that the employee is providing to you upfront about the kind of arrangements they would put in place for a suitable workspace.
Absolutely. And then the last question on this list, before we move into what's come through on the live chat, is it's moving away from the remote working, and it is obviously coming in from someone who has work that cannot be done from home. So they have employees working on site, they've implemented health and safety protocols, and they've put a lot of work into ensuring it's a safe workplace. And they have a policy in place. Employees have received training, and they want to know an employee is concerned regarding use of shared kitchen facilities, and they want to know is the training and the policies they have in place enough, or should they be doing more with this particular employee?
Okay. What I would say to the employer is first to make sure that they are doing, what they should be doing. Check out the public health advice, and check out, again, there's a lot of resources on our website if people want to see what they need to do. We have a range of checklists and templates which employers can fly through very quickly, and we are, if you like, we're prompting all of the correct asks that they need to take into account. So I guess in that scenario, what you're doing is you're making the employee aware of the measures you've taken. Presumably people are trained in what those measures are. And in relation to a kitchen or canteen, what you're talking about there really is staggered breaks are important. You're talking about things like adequate distance between tables. You might be talking about screens in certain areas, depending on the setup. If it's kitchen, it could be quite small. And you're talking about the cleaning of frequent touch points. So I think if you've done the things that you're supposed to do as an employer, and you've communicated that, and I suppose given a bit of assurance to the employee, then I think there's no reason why the employee shouldn't be, I suppose their concerns shouldn't be assuaged. The other conversation which might need to be had there is, does the employee have any particular concerns about their own health? Are they in a high risk category or in a very high risk category? Now, it's not that all of that information is, it doesn't have to be disclosed to the employer, but, there are conversations there where it might actually be because somebody actually is quite vulnerable, and that's why they have the concern. So I would say check that you have everything is in place, make sure that everybody is trained up on it. And you also need, and I suppose through the work safety protocol, the lead worker representative, which is there and in most workplaces and should be there. That's where the employee can go to somebody to say, look, actually they've said they're doing this, but actually that's not really happening. So the employee should be encouraged, really, it's in everybody's interest to make sure that the measures that have been put in place, when you've gone to the trouble of putting them in place, but actually everybody's abiding by them. So there's a kind of an upward communication piece there as well, which could be useful for the employer, because you can't ignore those scenarios. And we do get complaints sometimes into the authority from employees who are concerned, where people might think they have everything in place, but it's either not in place or maybe the measures aren't being implemented properly.
Okay. So we'll move on to the live chat questions. So the first one that's here is, if an employer refuses to use equipment supplied, for example, they don't want an adjustable chair or they don't want a screen for their laptop, what would your advice be? And if they don't have a suitable workplace at home, can they be working at home, or should alternative arrangements like a temporary layoff or something be put in place? So there's two fairly hefty elements to that question.
Yeah, you might have to repeat the first bit again, Coach.
So the first bit is how to deal with an employee who has said they don't want an adjustable chair or, say, a screen for a laptop or some other equipment that's being provided by an employer. How do you handle that situation?
Well, the reality is it's up to the employer to make the workplace safe for the employee, and it's the employee's duty to follow the instructions that the employer gives them. So in a scenario where, a risk assessment has been carried out and employers have responded to that by putting in place, the correct equipment, and the employee is refusing to accept that equipment and essentially then maybe not agreeing to work safely, well then that's probably more over to you, Coach, on that side. Then it becomes something to do with HR, because the employee is obliged to follow the instructions and to cooperate with their employer in following safety advice and wearing PPE, for example. It would be another one. You have to wear it if it's been provided for you. You have to take the training if it's been offered to you from a health and safety perspective.
Absolutely, and I think we go back to your policy on this one. The stronger your policy is around all of this, the easier it is going to be for you to deal with this if it does arise. And ultimately, as Joanne said, it may become a failure to follow reasonable management request, a failure to follow health and safety procedures, and ultimately it may become a disciplinary procedure. So having all of this in your policy is absolutely going to protect you there. So that policy is just a key piece of documentation in all of this. The next one is looking for any advice on only using a laptop screen versus a monitor. Now, this one is close to my heart. I'm a person who has to have a big monitor, and regardless of where I am, I need a monitor in front of me. If I'm looking at a laptop, I'll crack up. So this is somebody looking for advice on only using a laptop screen and where that would sit within the health and safety aspects of it.
Yeah, well, if you're working remotely, for a long duration in front of a VDU, you do need to have appropriate equipment, and for most people that will be a separate monitor. And in fact, what a lot of people will have is, and I know we do it ourselves in the HSA, you have one laptop, but when you're at home, you have the keyboard and the mouse, so that you're not hunched up over your laptop using the keyboard of the laptop, if you like. But again, that's kind of part of your common sense risk assessment. I'm going to be doing this for 7 or 8 hours. I'm at the desk, I'm at home now, so I need to make sure that my display screen equipment is appropriate for me, and that I have a separate keyboard and a mouse. It's different if you're on a very ad hoc basis. You've decided for the morning you're working at home. That's a different thing. But in terms of a planned ongoing arrangement where you would be working from home for X number of days per week, you do need to take account of those things, which will include, things like separate keyboard, mouse, and a monitor, for example.
And then somebody has come in asking about the competent assessment that you mentioned, and they asked, can they have employees self-assessing their workspace, and what does an employer need to provide to employees so that they can be considered competent to do this?
Yeah, you can't self-assess your own workstation under the law. What you can do is assist that process. And again, I refer people back to the checklist and template risk assessment in the guidance. The employee can use that to help them set up correctly and to help identify the equipment they need to do their job. But it has to be done by law. It has to be done by a competent assessor. Now, I think I said earlier, some employers might choose to train people within their workforce to be display screen assessors, DSE assessors. There's training out there that you can do on that, or hire the services of an external competent person, such as a health and safety professional or an external DSE assessor, who will do that for you. And as I said earlier, they can be done remotely.
Okay. And this one, I think, is one that is a concern for anyone who lives even slightly remotely in Ireland. This is asking, if an employer doesn't have adequate Wi-Fi but wants to work from home, are they required to provide, is the employer required to provide Wi-Fi for them?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I suppose I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that, because it's one of those things, obviously that's part of a kind of a national initiative. You can't always have it when you want it, can't always be arranged. One would have thought if the employer is keen for the person to work from home, it may be part of their agreement that, we will finance this, or we will put it in place for you. As we know, there's a lot of discussion around, the costs on employees, on them working at home. So I think revenue have some little bit of tax back that you can get there, but there are probably more conversations to be had around that in the future. And I'm guessing that will evolve, and the national conversation around that may evolve as well, as more people do look to work from home, but realise there are costs for them, because obviously where there's a cost for the employer, perhaps on one side in providing equipment, there are other employers who are looking at this as an opportunity to downsize their premises, for example, or to try and reduce their annual rental. So as I said, it's not maybe fully pinned down, but I would say certainly it's something that should be addressed in the policy if it's something that you're willing to do or you plan to do for your employees.
Absolutely, and I think this ties into the national strategy that was released around remote working at the start of the year. And that did make reference to the national broadband strategy. So I think, yeah, as it stands at the moment, if an employee doesn't have Wi-Fi, there isn't an obligation on the employer if they're not inclined to have them working from home. There isn't an obligation on them to provide the Wi-Fi, but it is a conversation that's going to be had. And as we get more and more into seeing what this legislation around remote working is going to look like, I think we'll have more of an idea at that stage. So now I'm conscious of the time, but we'll go to one more. So if sorry, now that's the one I've already seen. Now speaking of Wi-Fi, we're very slow to load this document for me here. Now we have 4 more. If you do, yes, and I think this one sits possibly more with myself. What can you do if an employee refuses to come back to work to the work premises full-time but insists on blended working? So I suppose as it stands at the moment, and Joanne, you might have something to say on this, within the COVID environment, obviously there is a health and safety aspect of somebody being in the workplace if they don't have to be. So that's a slightly separate discussion. But under normal circumstances, as it stands at the moment, there is no right to work from home. It's not, no employer is obliged to provide it, and it is done at the discretion of an employer. There is legislation coming down the line where there will be a right to request to work from home, and that will change things slightly in that an employer will be expected to provide a reason as to why it can't be done. So I would be suggesting to employers that if they feel that the work that they have at the moment cannot be done from home, they would be starting to get the paperwork in motion, starting to do an assessment of that job, getting up and running as to why it couldn't be done from home, so that if they do get the request that they would have the back broken on it. But as it stands at the moment, the answer to that one in my view would be that it's fairly straightforward. Nobody has a direct right to demand to work from home, and as it stands, it's at the discretion of the employer. Then we move on to oh, this is an interesting one, actually. I see some employers are insisting that the employees come to the office to collect their equipment. Will this be classed as driving for work, and would you advise that the employer delivers the equipment rather than bringing them on site?
Gosh, I'm not sure whether that's HR or health and safety.
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of both in terms of, I suppose on the driving for work classification, if they are not coming into the office and staying a full day and working and then bringing their equipment home with them, absolutely it's driving for work. If they're coming in specifically to collect their equipment, it is absolutely classed as driving for work. So that is the first point. And then I think, and Joanne, you might have a little bit more to add on this one, but in terms of advising the employer delivers the equipment, I would suggest that really relies on their COVID protocols and what they have in place, and whether it is a safe environment to bring somebody into.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we know, people shouldn't be at work and should be working from home where they can. And we have the list of published essential businesses where people can work from home. I'm assuming the question there, Coach, relates to the one-off. Is that the scenario you're talking about? Somebody who is going in on a one-off basis to collect equipment as opposed to something more regular? Is that?
Yes, that I think is what the question is getting at.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that, you've got 2 options there, I suppose. Again, there's a bit of flexibility. I think it might suit a lot of people to go in and collect the equipment and see what they need themselves. If you're doing that though, and I know a lot of employers have arranged that, obviously you're staggering the number of people who are coming in at any one time and all that sort of thing in terms of COVID. Other employers may have decided, look, it's in this scenario we're going to deliver the equipment out. But as I think it's really up to the employer. I'm not sure, whether you're driving for work. Yeah. What are the additional measures you're taking in place there? We're talking about a, common sense approach here and a kind of a one-off basis, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And there's another one that's come in, and I think, again, that this might tip slightly more into my area. Would employees expect the employer to cover the increase in light and heating costs as a result of working from home? So I suppose there is a couple of things to consider here, and the revenue have essentially set it up that there's two ways that this can be dealt with. So an employer can give a lighting and heating allowance. It's up to $3.20 a day, tax-free. So an employer can do that, or alternatively, an employee can claim tax relief on their lighting and heating bills. So again, there's no obligation on an employer to cover it, but there are methods to do so. And if an employer isn't covering it, there are methods to claim tax relief against it, so that the employer is getting a bit of relief on it anyway, the employee. So then from that one, we have now I've heard firsthand that insurance companies are now very worried about the potential for civil cases as a result of not setting up the home working environment and the subsequent ill health or injuries. If we allow an employee to use their own equipment and make them responsible for the work environment, is this not leaving employers wide open? So I think this is a big one, Joanne, that is causing concern for employers, is their liability when somebody is working from home.
Yeah. And understandably, which is, I suppose, why you want to make sure you're set up correctly from, when you're planning this remote working arrangement and you have an agreement there. I think it has to be clear what equipment people are using, whether it's if an employee chooses to use their own equipment and something that the employer hasn't provided, then they must make sure that equipment is safe to use. And if it's not safe to use, they need to decommission it and take it out of circulation. Similarly, if the employer provides the equipment, that's the equipment the employer is responsible for. And the employer needs to, I suppose, respond to any requests from the employee around whether the equipment is faulty, and the employee is obliged to report that, by the way. This equipment is faulty, so the employer must either repair or replace it. So I think that's how I would approach it on a practical basis. And again, you have to think about the home as, the entire home isn't the workplace. It's the workspace and the workstation you're looking at. And as I said, through the risk assessment, that's how the employer assures themselves. And again, this is all about what's reasonable and practical to do. They assure themselves that this has been set up properly. I'm clear on the equipment I've provided. I'm responsible for that. But if the employee is using other equipment that they are providing themselves because it suits them, or for whatever reason, they need to make sure that that equipment is safe. The same with electrical sockets, or that being used in the home, or the overall lighting, maybe not task lighting that's specific to a job, but that is the responsibility of the employee, because it is their home, and their home is the primary dwelling, and the kind of normal common sense things that you would do to service and to make sure your home was safe, you still have to do those. If we can think about it as the workstation and the workspace, rather than the attic where there's a tile missing that you could slip on, or do you know what I mean? Something like that. We need to kind of separate the two. And I know it's difficult sometimes, but I think that's the way I would think about it. Think about the work that's being done and the equipment that has been provided. And that's what the employer is responsible for.
Absolutely. Okay, so look, I'm conscious that we've run a bit over time, so we might finish this up there, Joanne, but just to reassure anyone who has a question that we didn't get to, that we will follow up with you and we will come back to you individually on your questions. So just to say, Joanne, thanks so much for doing that. Really appreciate it. I think that was invaluable expertise for people to get in terms of all of this. It's a huge change for people to have to adapt to. So thanks very much for giving us your time today.
No problem at all, Coach. And thanks very much to yourself and to Neil. I can see Neil on the call there as well. It's a great opportunity, and delighted if there's any particular queries people have afterwards, no problem at all. They can send them on to me. And I would just say, do go to the web, because there are an extraordinary number of FAQs and resources there that will help you with all of this.
Absolutely. And just to highlight to everyone, Maeve has been diligently throwing links on anything we're talking about into the chat there. So there's plenty of links available as to what is on both our own website and the HSA website. And then again, we would also, on our own website, we do have links to the HSA website and where all of this useful information is. So plenty of information out there and worth having a look at. So thank you very much to everyone for attending, and we hope you all got something out of this. And if you have any further questions in relation to this, you can contact myself on our HR email or through the phone line for member HR advice. So if you have any further questions on this, absolutely, we can help you out. And Joanne has kindly agreed that on the health and safety aspect of stuff, if anyone has follow-on questions from this, if we need to liaise with her, she's willing to do so. So if you have any questions, send them through.